I went to my first yoga class in the 1990s when I was in my mid-20s. I was trying to impress somebody I wanted to date, and they did yoga, so I went to a class. Something happened in that first class, something that I couldn't define at the time that made me want to keep going back, and so I did. Back then I was a nightclub promoter in Washington, D.C., living the unhealthy life of a night owl, frequently staying up way past sunrise, drinking and doing various drugs, then sleeping all day and starting it all over again the next night. On one of those days, after one of those nights, I tried to sleep it off on my living room couch, but was repeatedly awoken by the sound of myself gasping for air, having stopped breathing as I would drift into unconsciousness, and it scared me. That experience was a turning point for me. Although my yoga practice was new, I had already developed a deeper understanding of and relationship with my breath, and it was obvious as I struggled to breathe on that hungover day that the things I was doing at night were eroding my ability to take good breaths in the daytime. A life-changing choice was presented to me that day. I could slowly kill myself by continuing with the nightlife, or I could go more deeply into what yoga practice had begun to teach me about my life and living it well. The fact that you're hearing my voice right now points to the choice I made. If I'd kept living my life as I had been, I wouldn't have lived long enough to know even what a podcast is. More importantly, I would never have experienced the thing that yoga taught me to do, to live life fully as a human being. That was more than 25 years ago. That choice I made on my couch that day still feels to me like it was the beginning of my real life. I never could have imagined the places that decision would take me. Yoga has taken me deep inside myself and around the world, teaching all kinds of people in all kinds of settings. I started teaching asana classes in studios in 1997. Then a few years later, after relocating to Los Angeles, which was the yoga mecca at that time, I began going around the world teaching people how to teach yoga. And after a few years of that, I started writing and producing teacher training programs of my own, then started teaching other teachers how to teach other people how to teach. But through it all, I've been on a quest to try to understand, break down, and articulate precisely what it is about yoga practice that has the effect of showing people the way to a better life, as it's shown me. Further, I have worked all this time on developing and continually honing a set of teaching skills that allow that practice to be taught. Yoga has taken me from a life of misery to a life of rich experience and deep contentment. What I'm going to do in this series is explain to you exactly how that happened and how I have learned to teach that to other people. In this podcast series, I'm going to share with you what I've learned so that you might more skillfully articulate and share the benefits of yoga asana practice. Welcome to Season 1 of the My Yoga Practice podcast. I'm James Brown. I've been teaching yoga for more than 20 years, and I've been teaching teachers how to teach for over 15 years. In this podcast, I intend to share with you the most important things that I've learned along the way. Yoga practice is to be tailored to the individual, yet it tends to be taught with a one-size-fits-all approach to people with different needs and abilities. In this podcast series, learn specific teaching strategies that allow each student in your classes to make the practice their own. Shortly after my big epiphany on the couch, I left my nightclub career and moved to a tiny Virginia town in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains for about a year so I could rest and regroup. It was there that I made my first attempts at teaching yoga classes. I would get friends to come to weekly classes in my living room by promising them a home-cooked meal after class, and it worked. In the safe, unstressed environment of my own living room, teaching people who wanted me to succeed, I began a lifelong journey of trying to share the thing that had helped me so much. About a year later, I made my way back to D.C., where I paid my rent by walking dogs and spent the rest of my time learning more about teaching by doing it. First, I rented a space at the Washington Ballet where I held weekly classes. Then I started teaching at a local gym, and then somehow began teaching privately to the family of the person who was Vice President of the United States at that time, Al Gore. All of that came together to open a lot of doors for me. Before long, I was dividing my time between guiding the practices of the Gore family in Washington, D.C. while Mr. Gore ran for president, and touring with and teaching the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who were the #1 rock band in the world at that time. The band was based in LA, so they would bring me there quite a bit while on break from the tour. So back and forth I would go. One week I was at the Democratic National Convention with the family of the candidate, and the next week I would be on a private plane heading to the MTV Video Music Awards with the band. It was all a lot of fun, and I was pretty thrilled about what I thought my certain fate would be, which is being the private teacher to the President of the United States. I mean, what could be better for a yoga teacher than guiding the most powerful person in the world through a practice that teaches, above all, that we and everything are all connected? As you know, fate didn't end up taking me anywhere near the White House. When it started looking like George Bush would be the next president, I started working on a backup plan, and I knew it couldn't happen in D.C. for me. I had been to LA a lot over the past year. I liked it, I had friends there, and the band wanted me to come there and keep teaching them after the tour. But I wanted to also teach at a studio, so I called a person who I had heard a lot about but had never met. She owned a yoga studio in Santa Monica called Yoga Works that, although small, was turning out the most influential teachers in the yoga world at that time. The common denominator behind all of those teachers was this woman who would become my teacher and mentor for 19 years, Maty. My first calls to her were at the time that the Supreme Court hearings, the ones that would decide who the next president would be, were happening. I couldn't believe that such an important figure in the yoga world was taking the time to talk to me, somebody she'd never heard of. But it turned out that she was a huge fan of Mr. Gore and was watching the events playing out in D.C., along with me and the rest of the world, very closely. The thing I remember most about my first conversation with her, once I explained to her that I would be looking for a job teaching in LA if Mr. Gore didn't become president, was her response, which was, "He better fucking become president." That was my first exposure to a couple of things about Maty. One was in the simple gesture of taking the time to talk to me, somebody she didn't know. She was showing the part of herself that no matter how big of a deal she was in the yoga business, she was always looking for beginning teachers who might have some potential, and that was what she somehow saw in me. But the other thing, the one that really got me, was that she was one of the first yoga teachers I had ever heard drop an F-bomb. Nowadays, everybody says fuck all the time, but that wasn't the case back then, and fuck was certainly not something you'd hear coming from the clean mouths of most yoga folks. And seriously, as silly as it seems, that meant the world to me. Since I had begun teaching 4 years before, I had felt like a dirty outsider in the yoga world. My past of drinking and drugging and dancing all night didn't seem to fit in with the stereotype of the clean-living, ultra-pure teacher of yoga, which has turned out to be a whole lot of virtue signaling anyway. But I didn't know that back then, and there I was, sitting on the edge of my bed in Washington, D.C., on the phone to this yoga legend, saying to myself in my head, did she just say fuck? Did I just find my teacher? I did find my teacher. I moved to LA a month after the inauguration of George W. Bush and began to work for and learn from Maty. I took her teacher training, started teaching at her studio, assisted her for many years, and taught the teacher training that she developed more than 20 times around the world. A few years after she sold and left Yoga Works, I started my own teacher training. It was then that I started to really examine the elements of the methodology that she had taught me and that had changed my life so much. It's not fair or reasonable to try to fit Maty's methodology into a few sentences, but I'm going to try to do it anyway for now, because life is not always fair and reasonable, and this is one of those moments. And because I'll go into much more detail about each of them later. First, Maty only taught the things that she knew well. Second, Maty carefully watched her students at all times so as to inform her about what her next instructions should be. Third, Maty saw each student as the central figure in their own practice, and that she was only a guide, there to usher them through their own unique experience. Fourth, Maty prepared thoroughly for each class that she taught. Fifth, Maty saw herself always humbly as a student. No matter how many people adored and respected her, she was always trying to examine her weaknesses and improve upon them. And finally, Maty always taught with compassion and empathy. The first trips I took to teach teacher training outside the U.S. were to Asia. It was there that I learned that once you get outside of the insular LA yoga world, things are quite different. I learned that I had become quite skilled at teaching LA yoga to LA people, but that people outside LA didn't necessarily share the same motivations and desires as people in LA. And I'm so grateful for that experience because it made me start asking the question, what is this yoga thing anyway? I thought I already knew, but my students in Asia showed me that I really only knew the Southern California version of it. They just didn't care about the same things that my LA students cared about. If I was to teach a yoga that could work for everybody, I knew I needed to dig deeper. And so dig I did. I started to closely study the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the main text used to guide modern practices. Through years of working with it, living through it, translating it, discussing it, and teaching it, I think I finally understand. And that has provided the basis for all of the elements of the teaching methodology that I intend to share with you in this series. The impetus for this series came about this past summer. On July the 9th, I was wrapping up a year in Sweden, where I had set up an online school for a yoga company. I was in the middle of taking a couple weeks off before moving to London, where I intended to do the same for another yoga company based there. When I woke up that morning, I checked my phone while still in bed and read a text that I am still working to wrap my head around almost 3 months later. It said, Maty died. Maty Ezraty died when she was only 55 years old. She had just completed a teacher training in Tokyo. She died in her sleep. Death, as everybody knows, is an odd thing. At first I was in shock, then I was angry at myself for not having called her the day before when I thought maybe I should. Like so many people feel when they lose somebody special, I ached for an opportunity to tell her what she meant to me. A week later, in my new home in London, I dreamt that I got to see Maty again. She had returned from some kind of retirement or other similar post-teaching life. She had dyed her hair, which was dark before, a bright blonde, which looked surprisingly good. I think my mind made her appear blonde to signify that she had shifted forms, which is a thing that I'd not been able to accept until this dream. In the dream, she and I were taking a yoga class that was taught by some old student of hers, a peer of mine, but I never saw who it was. The class went on for over 2 hours and eventually started going off the rails, integrating jogging around the room and some form of water acrobatics. Maty was horrified by the spectacle, and she rolled her eyes at me when the teacher wasn't looking. She asked me quietly in her funny nasal voice, "Why is this class so long? What were they thinking putting this on the schedule?" And then all the students got bored and left, before the class was really over and the teacher sort of followed them out, defeated. And now Maty and I were alone together. We sat down at a small, solid wooden table, and I told her I needed to say something before she went away again. She gave me her full attention and looked deeply into my eyes, just as she had done so many times while she was alive. She asked me what was going on. I said to her, "I love you. I'm so sorry that I didn't tell you how important the things you taught me have been to me." As I spoke, I cried, and she held my hands in hers on the table, listening without reacting, just listening as I cried, looking into my heart, as only she ever could. I woke up from the dream, fully crying, and I cried in the dark in my bed for a while. I cried into my pillow so my dogs wouldn't wake up, because one of them believes that his main purpose in life is to stick his tongue way up my nostrils when I sneeze or cry, and I didn't want that. And I wanted to fully absorb what had just happened because it was important. I felt like I had just been with Maty. I really needed that. I don't think her spirit visited me, but I also don't think it's ever left me, nor that it ever will. I think that the part of her that is part of me as remembered experience was animated by my mind in sleep, and it made something happen that I had needed so badly since I'd learned of her passing. It let me open my heart and pour out the words that I wish I'd said to Maty while she was alive, but I didn't know that she would die. Maty taught me and so many other people how to be fully alive. That's a big part of why so many of us are not able to fathom this new reality. But I finally got to say goodbye to her that night, and I feel like I'm able to pick myself up now and get back to teaching what she taught me, which is what she and I have always wanted. Eventually, I went back to sleep, and when I woke up the next morning, it was clear to me that I needed to share what Maty had taught me. As I said before, death can have surprising consequences. One of the first truly weird things that happened in my head after she died was that I now knew the start date and the end date of my learning from her. I had learned all of the lessons she would teach me, and she taught me so much. And right on the tail end of that realization came the understanding that it's my duty to her to teach what she taught me. So this podcast is going to be a record of those things. In it, I will tell you what she taught me so that you can learn to speak in a way that drives each student to take an active role in tailoring their practice, thereby realizing the potential of the physical body to provide context for a transformative experience of yoga in its most pure form. You can see pictures of Maty and I, and get a link to her New York Times obituary on the podcast page at myyogapractice.com. There you can also access resources for teachers and practitioners of modern postural yoga, including over 100 video lessons that exist to help teachers teach yoga better. And you can also learn about and book private long-distance mentorship sessions for teachers. Please rate, review, subscribe to, and share the My Yoga Practice podcast. Thank you for listening.